Hello, I'm Patryk Pawlak. I'm part-time professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies here at the European University Institute and the project director of the Global Initiative for the Future of the Internet. Today we're going to have a chat with Riana Pfefferkorn, who works at Stanford University, about a topic that's quite critical for the conversation about digital authoritarianism and the open and free internet, which is that of encryption. Riana, thank you for having a chat with us and accepting the invitation.
Thanks so much for bringing me here.
So I'll maybe start with a very general question. We're having this discussion in a quite a peculiar time in the whole conversation about encryption and how it sort of fits within different policy debates about freedom of expression, surveillance, and free internet. So for those maybe who are not familiar with what encryption is about, you know very well that whenever we talk about those topics, they usually challenge some people when it comes to technological understanding. Why is encryption important? Let's start maybe with a general one. And why does it really matter for open and free internet?
Yeah, sure. Encryption is important because it's a means of protecting the privacy and data security and the data integrity and availability of all of our communications, of your private data, sensitive data like health records, for example, against anybody who might want to snoop on it who shouldn't be snooping at it. It's the best means that we know of providing protections that can be enshrined in various laws for data protection, for example, but that does this in a technical way that makes it harder to circumvent in the unfortunate circumstance where laws can be circumvented by bad actors who wish to potentially cause harm to people.
And a lot of your work actually focuses on exactly this legitimate use, right, of by law enforcement agencies maybe in accessing the communications versus those illegitimate uses where maybe authorities are violating some of those rights to privacy and let's say confidentiality of information, right? What are some of the key debates there, and where do you think we stand in this discussion about balancing legitimate access to the personal information of us as citizens and users of those technologies, and what governments might be claiming exactly the legitimate use for national security purposes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difficult and kind of intractable debate here that's been going on for about a quarter of a century, which shows how wicked of a question it is, in that if it were easy, maybe we would have figured it out by now. But the position from law enforcement is that they do have legitimate goals of investigating and apprehending people who are cloaking their bad acts behind the same encryption standards and the same encrypted apps and encrypted devices that everybody else uses for perfectly normal purposes. And you know, some of the responses I think from many of the people gathered here at this conference is that we've seen over and over again how even democratic governments can abuse their powers for accessing information to persecute people or to exceed their lawful authority. Something that I think is particularly important at a time of democratic backsliding, as we've been talking about here. And then on the other side, at a time also of rising national security concerns, I think in Europe and in America where I live and sort of across the world, there are still questions about how do we maintain protection for people's fundamental human rights and the rule of law, while also not completely impeding the ability of law enforcement and intelligence agencies to do their jobs.
And I think there is quite a big debate between the academic community and the policymakers, right, who are arguing that lowering the standards for encryption, for instance, is basically making everybody safe. But what does the research say? Can we explain to those watching us that actually probably quite the opposite is the contrary, right? It is the truth.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There is no known way to securely build an exception, or what we would commonly call a backdoor, into a strong encryption standard. Basically, anytime you create an exception, you're creating a vulnerability that can and will be exploited by bad actors. We just very recently have seen in the United States that there were reports that the Chinese government had been able to access the flaws basically in the security of our telecommunications networks that are there specifically to provide wiretap access for law enforcement. And this is exactly the kind of issue that we've been warning of in the policy community for decades. It's something that's happened here in Europe as well. It happened in Greece, for example, that the Greece telecom network was also accessed by possible foreign adversaries or foreign interests to make use of the holes built for wiretapping for Greek telecom. And so this is an example of how we don't really have a good way of building in access just for the good guys that will not also be accessed by people for whom it is not intended.
So basically what you're saying is that whenever the governments tell us we want to have this backdoor in order to make you safer, what they actually de facto do is making all of us less secure, because this backdoor can be used not only by them, but anybody else who finds it.
Anybody else who finds it, possibly, and at a level where the capabilities of discovering and exploiting that backdoor may mean that that actor has enough sophistication that it may be very difficult to discover that intrusion. And so we may have a false sense of security in thinking, okay, only the good guys are potentially able to access this, when there may be bad actors hiding in these networks and making use of that access to collect information or to just wait and bide their time for some other action later on.
Can international organizations and bodies play any role in this conversation when it comes to setting certain standards, right? We've heard a lot about standardizations in different discussions. Is this an option? Is this a path? Can we think of a global standard that could, for instance, steer those conversations, or you think it's actually impossible?
From a policy standpoint, I think it is difficult. We've seen so many strong debates going on in the European Union around drafting regulation to try and permit greater surveillance in the name of law enforcement. At the same time, from the technical side, we've seen strong participation by cryptographers and the security community to try and continually work on finding better and more robust standards for both present-day encryption as well as post-quantum encryption that will be able to survive attempts to attack currently known encryption technologies to decrypt data by much more powerful computers that haven't quite come into full commercial practice yet. So I think it's a matter of greater cooperation by scientists, technologists, mathematicians to work on this, against a background where there's a lot of suspicion right now, I think, in the diplomatic sphere between Western interests and Russia or China, and nations that have also an interest in building greater capacity for breaking encryption.
And the private sector, as you've already flagged, plays an important role in it, right? So what should companies do, or what role can they play in establishing strong encryption standards, and how their relationship with the government actually is evolving? What we as citizens should actually require companies to do, those with whom we actually have contracts for the use of specific tools, applications, hardware, software, and so on?
I think here it's actually been a matter of both companies as well as nonprofit entities like Signal, for example, that have been setting the standard by just going ahead and doing it, just deploying strong encryption for devices, for communications, for messaging apps, and just turning that on so that billions of people can now enjoy it. And that helps normalize encryption as something that is in daily use, that protects all of us for encrypting the internet, for example, of all our web traffic. And that, I think, builds maybe a virtuous cycle where then that can feed into regulatory efforts to say, actually, it is a good idea to set in part of data breach laws or data security laws to say you have to do at least a sufficiently good job of encrypting people's data if you're going to collect it for commercial purposes, for example. So I think it's kind of it's been building on itself to normalize the use, the deployment, and really start to demand it in a lot of settings. But this, again, comes into direct tension with other elements of government that are focused on other equities around law enforcement, around national security.
And one of the big discussions these days is the spread of new technologies, AI, quantum computing, right, and how that actually fits within the broader discussion about encryption. Western governments in Europe, US would tell us, we really have to invest more in those technologies because we have to get there ahead of potentially authoritarian regimes. But as you have also said, that things can happen anywhere, not only in the authoritarian regimes. What is it that we should be keeping an eye on within our societies, and specific aspects on which we should be really watching our own governments when it comes to the conversation about encryption, AI, post-quantum encryption, as you already said?
I think what I've seen is a trend away from governments making overt demands to weaken encryption standards, and more coming at it from a more subtle direction of saying, we want to start backwards from the goal of protecting children or of reducing terrorist attacks, and therefore we want to implement regulation that would impose obligations on companies or on anybody offering an ICT service, for example, to basically help achieve that end. And then if you look at it, what that actually means is weakening encryption or otherwise providing greater surveillance capabilities. So instead of saying this is an overt attack on encryption's availability, I think we should be watching for governments trying to propose regulations that would have the intended consequence of trying to restrict the availability of strong encryption to be offered by companies and other organizations.
And one final question, since we're looking already forward a bit, what are some of the research avenues where you think we should be focusing on? Does it have to do with specific technologies, processes, maybe some of the regional case studies where you think we should be diving in order to better sort of understand the direction in which we're heading?
It's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of important work that's been going on in both the technical domain and in the policy domain. I think right now a particularly cogent question is whether it is feasible to adopt the sorts of export controls on the materials for building quantum computers that we're starting to see be proposed in some areas that will allow, that will protect interests in protecting human rights and protecting domestic competitiveness without unintentionally also hurting our ability to build the kinds of computer systems that everybody internationally should have, I think, equitable access to going forward.
Great. Riana, thank you for the conversation, and to everybody watching, thank you for watching us.
Thank you.